1884 FI 1889. Post-FI Civil War expansion. 1884-1889. Post-Civil War expansion. 1912. Contiguous USA All States. 1912. Contiguous USA All States. Key states, territories, disputed areas, other countries' history. Colonial frontier. Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap in the colonial era. Before 1776, the West was of high priority for settlers and politicians. The American frontier began when Jamestown, Virginia, was settled by the English in 1607. In the earliest days of European settlement on the Atlantic coast, until about 1680, the frontier was essentially any part of the interior of continent beyond the fringe of existing settlements along the Atlantic coast. 20. English, French, Spanish and Dutch patterns of expansion and settlement were quite different. Only a few thousand French migrated to Canada. These habitants settled in villages along the St. Lawrence River, building communities that remained stable for long stretches. Although French fur traders ranged widely through the Great Lakes and Midwest region, they seldom settled there. French settlement was limited to a few very small villages such as Kaskaskia, Illinois, 21, as well as a larger settlement around New Orleans. In what is now New York State, the Dutch set up fur trading posts in the Hudson River Valley, followed by large grants of land to rich landowning patroons who brought in tenant farmers who created compact, permanent villages. They created a dense rural settlement in upstate New York, but they did not push westward. 22. Areas in the north that were in the frontier stage by 1700 generally had poor transportation facilities, so the opportunity for commercial agriculture was low. These areas remained primarily in subsistence agriculture, and as a result, by the 1760s these societies were highly egalitarian, as explained by historian Jackson Turner Maine. The typical frontier society, therefore, was one in which class distinctions were minimized. The wealthy speculator, if one was involved, usually remained at home, so that ordinarily no one of wealth was a resident. The class of landless poor was small. The great majority were landowners, most of whom were also poor because they were starting with little property and had not yet cleared much land, nor had they acquired the farm tools and animals which will one day make them prosperous. Few artisans settled on the frontier except for those who practiced a trade to supplement their primary occupation of farming. There might be a storekeeper, a minister, and perhaps a doctor, and there were several landless laborers. All the rest were farmers. 23. In the south, frontier areas that lacked transportation, such as the Appalachian Mountains region, were mainly based on subsistence farming and resembled the egalitarianism of their northern counterparts, although they had a larger upper class of slave owners. North Carolina was representative. However, frontier areas of 1700 that had good river connections were increasingly transformed into plantation agriculture. Rich men came in, bought up the good land, and worked it with slaves. The area was no longer frontier. It had a stratified society comprising a powerful upper-class white landowning gentry, a small middle class, a fairly large group of landless or tenant white farmers, and a growing slave population at the bottom of the social pyramid. Unlike the North, where small towns and even cities were common, the South was overwhelmingly rural. 24. From British peasants to American farmers. The seaboard colonial settlements gave priority to land ownership for individual farmers, and as the population grew they pushed westward for fresh farmland. 25. Unlike Britain, where a small number of landlords owned most of the land. Ownership in America was cheap, easy and widespread. Land. Ownership brought a degree of independence as well as a vote for local and provincial offices. The typical New England settlements were quite compact and small, under a square mile. Conflict with the Native Americans arose out of political issues, namely who would rule. 26. Early frontier areas east of the Appalachian Mountains included the Connecticut River Valley, 27, and northern New England, which ways a move to the north, not the west. 28. Wars with French and with natives. Siege of Fort Detroit during Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. Most of the frontiers experienced numerous conflicts. 29. The French and Indian War broke out between Britain and France, with French making up for their small colonial population base by enlisting native war parties as allies. The series of large wars spilling over from European wars ended in a complete victory for the British in the worldwide 7 Years' War. In the Peace Treaty of 1763, France ceded practically everything, as the lands west of Mississippi River, in addition to Florida and New Orleans, went to Spain. Otherwise, lands east of the Mississippi River and what is now Canada went to Britain. Steady migration to frontier lands. Regardless of wars, Americans were moving across the Appalachians into western Pennsylvania, what is now West Virginia, and areas of the Ohio Country, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In the southern settlements via the Cumberland Gap, their most famous leader was Daniel Boone. 30. Young George Washington promoted settlements in West Virginia on lands awarded to him and his soldiers by the royal government in payment for their wartime service in Virginia's militia. Settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains were curtailed briefly by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement in this area. Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768, reopened most of the western lands for frontiersmen to settle. 31. New Nation. The nation was at peace after 1783. The states gave Congress control of the western lands and an effective system for population expansion was developed. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 abolished slavery in the area north of the Ohio River and promised statehood when a territory reached a threshold population, as Ohio did in 1803. 32. 33. The first major movement west of the Appalachian Mountains originated in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina as soon as the Revolutionary War ended in 1781. Pioneers housed themselves in a rough lean-to or at most a one-room log cabin. The main food supply at first came from hunting deer, turkeys, and other abundant game. Clad in typical frontier garb, leather breeches, moccasins, fur cap, and hunting shirt, and girded by a belt from which hung a hunting knife and a shot pouch all homemade, the pioneer presented a unique appearance. In a short time he opened in the woods a patch, or clearing, on which he grew corn, wheat, flax, tobacco, and other products, even fruit. 34. In a few years, the pioneer added hogs, sheep, and cattle, and perhaps acquired a horse. Homespun clothing replaced the animal skins. The more restless pioneers grew dissatisfied with over-civilized life and uprooted themselves again to move 50 or 100 miles, 80 or 160 kilometers, further west. Land policy. Map of the Wilderness Road by 1785. The land policy of the new nation was conservative, paying special attention to the needs of the settled East. 35. The goals sought by both parties in the 1790-1820 era were to grow the economy, Avoid draining away the skilled workers needed in the East. Distribute the land wisely. Sell it at prices that were reasonable to settlers yet high enough to pay off the national debt. Clear legal titles, and create a diversified Western economy that would be closely interconnected with the settled areas with minimal risk of a breakaway movement. By the 1830s, however, the West was filling up with squatters who had no legal deed, although they may have paid money to previous settlers. The Jacksonian Democrats favored the squatters by promising rapid access to cheap land. By contrast, Henry Clay was alarmed at the lawless rabble heading west who were undermining the utopian concept of a law-abiding, stable middle-class Republican community. Rich Southerners, meanwhile, looked for opportunities to buy high-quality land to set up slave plantations. The Free Soil movement of the 1840s called for low-cost land for free white farmers, a position enacted into law by the new Republican Party in 1862, offering free 160 acres, 65 ha, homesteads to all adults, male and female, black and white, native-born or immigrant. 36. After winning the Revolutionary War, 1783, American settlers in large numbers poured into the West. In 1788, American pioneers to the Northwest Territory established Marietta, Ohio, as the first permanent American settlement in the Northwest Territory. 37. In 1775, Daniel Boone blazed a trail for the Transylvania Company from Virginia through the Cumberland Gap into central Kentucky. It was later lengthened to reach the falls of the Ohio at Louisville. The Wilderness Road was steep and rough, and it could only be traversed on foot or horseback, but it was the best route for thousands of settlers moving into Kentucky. 38. In some areas they had to face native attacks. In 1784 alone, natives killed over 100 travelers on the Wilderness Road. Kentucky at this time had been depopulated. It was empty of Indian villages. 39. However, raiding parties sometimes came through. One of those intercepted was Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, who was scalped in 1784 near Louisville. 40. Acquisition of indigenous lands. The War of 1812 marked the final confrontation involving major British and native forces fighting to stop American expansion. The British war goal included the creation of an Indian barrier state under British auspices in the Midwest which would halt American expansion westward. American frontier militiamen under General Andrew Jackson defeated the Creeks and opened the Southwest, while militia under Governor William Henry Harrison defeated the native British alliance at the Battle of the Thames in Canada in 1813. The death in battle of the native leader Tecumseh dissolved the coalition of hostile native tribes. 41. Meanwhile, General Andrew Jackson ended the native military threat in the southeast at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 in Alabama. In general, the frontiersmen battled the natives with little help from the U.S. Army or the federal government. 42. Native leader Tecumseh killed in battle in 1813 by Richard M. Johnson, who later became vice president to end the war. American diplomats negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, signed towards the end of 1814, with Britain. They rejected the British plan to set up a native state in U.S. territory south of the Great Lakes. They explained the American policy toward the acquisition of native lands the United States, while intending never to acquire lands from Indians otherwise than peaceably, and with their free consent, are fully determined, in that manner, progressively and in proportion as their growing population may require, to reclaim from the state of nature, and to bring into cultivation every portion of the territory contained within their acknowledged boundaries, in thus providing for the support of millions of civilized beings. They will not violate any dictate of justice or humanity, for they will not only give to the few thousand savages scattered over that territory an ample equivalent for any right they may surrender, but will always leave them the possession of lands more than they can cultivate, and more than adequate to their subsistence, comfort and enjoyment, by cultivation. If this is a spirit of aggrandizement, the undersigned are prepared to admit, in that sense, its existence, but they must deny that it affords the slightest proof of an intention not to respect the boundary as between them and European nations, or of a desire to encroach upon the territories of Great Britain. They will not suppose that government will avow, as the basis of their policy towards the United States, a system of arresting their natural growth within their territories, for the sake of preserving a perpetual desert for savages. 43. New territories and states. Thomas Jefferson saw himself as a man of the frontier and a scientist. He was keenly interested in expanding and exploring the West. As settlers poured in, the frontier districts first became territories with an elected legislature and a governor appointed by the president. Then when the population reached 100,000, the territory applied for statehood. 44. Frontiersmen typically dropped the legalistic formalities and restrictive franchise favored by Eastern upper classes and adopting more democracy and more egalitarianism. 45. In 1810 the western frontier had reached the Mississippi River. St. Louis, Missouri, was the largest town on the frontier, the gateway for travel westward, and a principal trading center for Mississippi River traffic and inland commerce, but remained under Spanish control until 1803. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Thomas Jefferson thought of himself as a man of the frontier and was keenly interested in expanding and exploring the West. 46. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the nation at the cost of $15 million, or about 4 cents per acre, $271 million in 2021 dollars, less than 42 cents per acre. 47. Federalists opposed the expansion, but Jeffersonians hailed the opportunity to create millions of new farms to expand the domain of landowning yeomen. The ownership would strengthen the ideal Republican society, based on agriculture, not commerce, governed lightly, and promoting self-reliance and virtue, as well as form the political base for Jeffersonian democracy. 48. France was paid for its sovereignty over the territory in terms of international law. Between 1803 and the 1870s, the federal government purchased the land from the native tribes then in possession of it. 20th century accountants and courts have calculated the value of the payments made to the natives, which included future payments of cash, food, horses, cattle, supplies, buildings, schooling, and medical care. In cash terms, the total paid to the tribes in the area of the Louisiana Purchase amounted to about $2.6 billion, or nearly $9 billion in 2016 dollars. Additional sums were paid to the natives living east of the Mississippi for their lands, as well as payments to natives living in parts of the West outside the Louisiana Purchase. 49. Even before the purchase, Jefferson was planning expeditions to explore and map the lands. He charged Lewis and Clark to explore the Missouri River, and such principal stream of it, as, by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river may offer the most direct and practicable communication across the continent for commerce. 50. Tom.
Yes, I was sleepy and click. So let's read again. It's 30 degrees hot in my living room. The video is just to split. Let's go and get some colas. I'm just an old YouTuber. but I will need to make a read list just for this because there's a lot of stuff there. I will add this one to my read again lists. So we have to go back, but I like to read more of this.